everybody, my name is Ben. I work for University of Minnesota Extension. I'm in a little sliver of Extension. You probably all know 4-H. And they're in one kind of big arm of Extension. And there's 4 arms of Extension. I'm in a little sliver called Community Vitality, which really is a newer area of Extension. We're only about 10 years old, but we have educators that do leadership, civic engagement work, and community economics work. And my role is a research fellow, so I do research on rural trends, rural demographics, rural economy, and bring that out to the countryside, and hopefully find ways for us to capitalize upon that. And I'd like to start with a little bit of background. So my undergrad is in math and statistics. I'm a data geek, I love data. Love it. But I know most people hate looking at tables of data. So hopefully all of the data I present to you today is going to be consumable, meaning it's going to be something you actually can understand and take home with you. My graduate work is in sociology. I went to the University of Missouri for 5 years, and it took me 5 years to get my master's, but I took my time and I learned a lot. I was in a rural sociology program, and really never did we question what rural meant. In my whole 5 years there, we never talked about what rural is, what rural does, how rural has changed. Our programs were focused primarily on agriculture and natural resource. As a data guy, I know that the rural economy has changed pretty significantly in the past 100 years. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But my role is really a non-agricultural rural sociologist. I'm here to help interpret what goes on in rural areas in everything except for agriculture, which generally today makes up about 95% of the rural economy. It's a little bit higher in some counties, a little bit lower in others, but it's not nearly the contributor to the rural economy as it once was. So, when I first started my training in this field, it's all negative. You hear nothing but bad news about rural areas, right? I mean, these are just a few examples. The kids are leaving. This is apparently a problem for our small towns when our kids leave. There's a brain, and this is called the brain drain, right? When we lose our kids after high school. Out-migration is a problem. We see plenty of reports and studies looking at out-migration and how to stem the flow of people away from your area. And I'm here to tell you today that is just fine to lose people from your community, and I'll tell you why in about 15 minutes. There's this brain drain, and rural areas are dying. This one was actually kind of troubling because during an earlier stint, I worked for the Center for Small Towns, which is an outreach unit out of Morris, and we had a conference every year, and it was called the Symposium on Small Towns. And we'd always invite legislators in to talk about, their view of rural and policy and things like that. And our very first year, one of the panelists said, rural areas are just dying. They're bleeding us dry. And I thought, why did we invite this guy to our celebration of small towns if this is the narrative that I hear? So this keeps going through my mind, right? Like, what am I doing in this field if all I'm going to do is help small towns go through a critical care aspect of life, like these towns are all dying, right? And you see the headlines. Rural Minnesota's in trouble. Rural populations continue to shrink. Oh, here, I do have this. People keep leaving rural America. Small towns are playing a role in their own demise. This one I want to take point with in a little bit, and you'll hear more about this, but this is the narrative. And a lot of the research I do is under the umbrella of rewriting the rural narrative, because I truly believe the narrative that we've been using to describe our small towns for the past 40 years has been horribly inaccurate. And I'm going to give you all of the data behind that. Everything I say here today will have a citation behind it. If you want that citation, I'll happily give it to you. So we do know there have been significant changes across rural Minnesota and really rural areas in general for the past 140 years. And I'll just look at the 1900s. In the early part of the 1900s, when you look at a map of Minnesota, or really of the nation, the towns aren't randomly placed across the countryside. They're along lines, and they're about every 8 to 12 miles apart, right? And they were placed there because of railroads and the proximity to get your agricultural products to the railroad, and then the railroad would bring it down to Kansas City or Chicago or Minneapolis or wherever it was going. So all these towns were formed based on an economy of agriculture. But things changed pretty significantly in the 20s and 30s as agriculture became more mechanized, and a fraction of the workers were required to be working actually on farm sites. You read headlines. I'm a big fan of reading newspapers, old newspapers, headlines. I'm a fan. I don't do it in my spare time, I guess, but I do it for work. You look back and you can read headlines that say, our town is really going to be dying if we lose ag as our primary industry. At the same time, you started to see roads and transportation systems take over. So really our interstate highway systems are somewhat new. They're not even 100 years old right now. Cars are new. You started to see all of these towns compete with one another as the road systems started to take over. And you started to see the rise of little regional centers. So again, not every town could house a full main street. And we'll talk about that in a second. Because of the changes in agriculture primarily, we saw a lot of population loss in our rural areas. So what used to be the 80-20 split, the 80% of Americans lived or worked on a farm and 20% were in a city, now started to flip. And we're at the kind of a polar end of that the other way. Only the 20% are people living in rural areas, and of that 20% that live in a rural area, 5% are engaged in ag or an ag-related industry. Churches started to close. Again, the headlines, there's a movie out there called Delafield, which tells a story about a church in southern Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, that closes. It's very sad. And there is kind of the straight line equation that if our church closes, our town is going to die. If our farms close, our town is going to die. This trend continued in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Main Street restructuring, this is a very kind word for businesses closing, right? So your grocery stores started to close in your small towns. Your hardware stores, not every town could support a full main street. So there were a number of effects that led to these changes. And it's not necessarily the fault of our small towns that we're in the position we are. So the rise of transportation systems, you saw regional centers start to pop up. The Willmar, the Mankato, the Worthington, Alexandria. Well, the towns directly surrounding those communities no longer could support a full main street, nor could they maintain the economies of scale to buy enough products at a discounted rate to provide a good price for the people there. And this isn't Little House on the Prairie anymore. It doesn't take you a day to get to the hospital in Mankato. You can get from one place to another fairly quickly. So the distance between these towns shrank considerably. So the impacts that they had led to a lot of, again, restructuring of our main streets. School consolidations, y'all are pretty aware of that. In the 80s and 90s especially, that trend has pretty much ended. But the number of school districts in Minnesota shrank. And if you look at the headlines or even the discussions during the time, it's if we lose our school, our town is going to die. People were afraid of this, but there's plenty of evidence out there that show this has actually made our schools stronger because of the demographic change we were in. Hospitals started to close too. Hospitals and clinics. So like Starbuck, Minnesota, I used to live in Hancock for 12 years. We just moved last year to St. Cloud, which is a big town. I really liked Hancock. It was a small town experience. We had a full K-12 school, which is actually pretty rare. But when you think about the impacts that these have, Starbuck lost their clinic and their school in 1 year. And this had a pretty detrimental effect on the narrative that people had about the community. But honestly, a lot of these changes are not the result of the people making bad decisions in our towns. They're the result of globalization. I'll tell you what, hardware stores closed in White Bear Lake too. But you don't hear about it because it's not as visible. When a hardware store closes in Hancock, everybody knows that hardware store closed. When a hardware store closes in White Bear, you got 5 other options, all within easy driving distance. You don't even notice that. Now, Fratelloni didn't close, but there's a Fratelloni hardware in White Bear Lake, and if they were to close, there are plenty of Home Depots and big boxes and other even family stores that can take their place. So in many ways, small towns are a microcosm. They're really the canary in the coal mine for globalization. Again, it's not the fault of people making bad decisions that led to these changes. These are changes that happen to your community from the outside. What differentiates community success is social capital. When all of these changes, if each of you in this room are a small town, all of these trends happen, the difference between how one small town reacts to another is social capital. Do you work together? And that's why efforts like this one, in my view, are vitally important to the future of our rural economy. So really, rural areas are changing, they're not dying. These changes impact rural and urban areas alike, and it's really just more apparent in rural areas. Again, this kind of canary in the coal mine, but I would actually argue that rural areas are models for success because we have managed all of these changes with volunteers, with local investment. When we talk about redesigning Minnesota, there was a whole special on Twin Cities Public Television called Redesigning Minnesota. Very good series. If you get a chance to go to the tpt.com, it might not be .com, don't. Just Google Twin Cities Public Television. Really good 8-part series there on what needs to happen because of the demographic changes that are going to take place. And my argument in my part of that series was that we should be looking to our small towns because we know how to get things done. School consolidations, we got it done. We've got school enrollments right now that are flat, if not increasing. We're not in the midst of decline right now, right? My key point here is that the research base does not support the notion that if you close blank, your town is taking the right turn into the ditch. Only 3 towns in the past 50 years have actually dissolved. And the most recent one was Tenney, population of 6. That is a small town. So if you're elected mayor in Tenney, you had to mow everybody's lawn. Okay, so what do I know? I'm a youngish guy in the rural field. 43, was pretty young in the rural development industry. And all I know is good news for small towns. I was not around during the agricultural crises of the first half of the 1900s, obviously. I was not cognizant of the changes of the credit crisis of the 70s. But here are some statistics for you. In fact, since 1970, the rural population has gone up by 11%. Let me say that again. Since 1970, the rural population, both in the United States and Minnesota, has gone up by 11%. What has gone down is the relative percentage of people that live in rural places. So, the pie gets bigger, but the relative share of people living in rural, and so this is the US. The red is the rural. 26% of Americans in 1970 lived in rural areas, and that dropped down to 19% in the most recent decennial census in 2010. Most people don't know this, because there's even headlines, and I don't know if I have this slide in here. If I don't, I'm going to find it for you before I'm done here. But the headlines only state the percentage. Let's go back to rural Minnesota's in trouble, continues to shrink. Oh, here's the one. Rural populations continue to shrink. Now, just in the past year, we had a decline in the rural population for the first time in like 60 years. And it was like 25,000 people using American Community Survey data, which has its own problems because of margin of error, and that's a whole nother conversation. So for the first time, the rural population declined. But what happens when your media narrative is negative? You know, the narrative is the framework that you're using to describe what's going on. And that narrative is about the rural decline, right? We actually had a decline for the first time, and how do they title it? Rural populations continue to shrink. Even though in the first line it said, it's the first time such a population decline has been recorded. This is the problem when you use an inaccurate frame to describe what's going on. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, the percentage of people has gone up. Again, the urban population went up at a rate faster than the rural, which results in a smaller percentage of people living in rural areas. Nationally, and there was a specific study done for this, and we haven't seen the updated numbers yet, but between 90 and 99, 2.2 million more people moved from the city to the country than vice versa. When I say country, I mean city, or I mean open country and small towns. This goes against the notion. Again, these are the stats I know about what's been going on since 1970. And I keep running up against this wall of narrative that's the doom and gloomers, right? Another point is population figures many times include formerly rural places. 30 years ago, Mankato and Blue Earth County was considered a rural county. But just 3 years ago, it was identified as an urban county. So, if you've got all of our rural counties in a list and you add up all of our rural population, and then you remove Blue Earth, which is kind of on the top end, right? They're one of the bigger population rural areas. You take that off, it looks like the rural population went down. Even though what happened was the county just graduated to urban status, if you want to call it that. So when you see statistics calculated based upon the removal of a county, so this is my statistics lesson. When you calculate an average, income, let's say, income, you take all of our counties, put their incomes together, calculate the average. But when you take out Blue Earth County, which is a higher income county, and you recalculate the average, your mean goes down. It's not because everybody all of a sudden started making less money in rural areas. It's because you just removed the top end from the mean. It's that simple. But these are the headlines that drive the narrative. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through my own experience of learning about what is going on in Minnesota. The sign outside of town is usually your indicator for success. Did your population sign go up or go down, right? If it went up, you're doing good. If it went down, you're dying, apparently. You're dying. But does decline really mean decline? And here's a statistic I ran into that just blew me away. And this changed how I look at population statistics forever. In any 5-year period, 43% of Minnesotans move. In any 5-year period, 43. And this includes people that move within the county into another county or out of state or into state or everything. But this blew me away thinking, wow, there are people moving in and out of your community all the time. So I want to look deeper into this. So I thought, okay, let's break people into smaller age groups and look at population change. So usually, demographers like me, when we calculate pop change, we look at number of people, we look at our starting population, we add in the number of people that moved in, subtract out the number of people that moved out, add in the number of births in that age cohort, which you aren't birthed at 35, you're birthed, on the front end. And then you subtract out the death rate, the number of people that died, and that's where you are for population. Now, birth and death rate have such an insignificant influence on the middle range of ages, I just disregard it. So what I want to do for this analysis, and what I'm going to show you here, is that we're going to look at groups of people by age. So let's say you 4 at this table right now are 10 to 14 years old, right? In 10 years, you're going to be 20 to 24. And if nobody ever moved in or out, you'd expect 4 people to be in your community that are 20 to 24 in 10 years. If you don't get it right away, I've got 2 different ways to show you this. But it's called cohorts, and I want to relate this to school cohorts. So like in first grade, if you all were in first grade, next year we expect you 4 to move on to second grade. And if you have 5 people that moved in, 5 kids that moved into second grade, somebody obviously moved in. You might have an interchange where you moved out and 2 people moved in, and now you have 5, but there's an intermix of population. This is a cohort, a very simplified cohort analysis. Okay, the first time I was asked to do a demographic analysis, this was for the West Central Initiative out of Fergus Falls, and we looked at EDA Region 4, which is Becker, Clay, Douglas, Grant, Otter Tail, Pope, Stevens, Traverse, and Wilkin counties. And I did this first analysis there. So we look at 2 bars here, the expected, which is how many people we expected to be in an age category from how big the cohort was 10 years ago, and the red bar is how many do we actually have. So in the 10 to 14 year age cohort, this one right here, 10 years ago they were 0 to 4. 10 years ago there were just under 14,000 in that age cohort. But today what we actually found in that age cohort that are 10 years older was just over 16,000. You aren't birthed to be 10 years old, so obviously there's no birth rate influence in here, right? So this is people moving in. And also 10-year-olds don't migrate by themselves. They come with someone. So what I noticed was, here are these gains where the red bar exceeds the blue is where we have more people than probably should have been there if nobody ever came and went, right? 10 to 14, 15 to 19. Then we start seeing declines in 20 to 24, 25 to 29. Again, subtract 10 years from this, and how old were they? They were in high school. Now they graduate. So we had just over 15,000 here, was down to under 10,000, lost a third of the kids after high school. This is the brain drain, right here. This is the meat of the brain drain, age cohorts. This drives the narrative about what's going on in many small towns. I've got colleagues who have been doing this for years. talking about the brain drain, how communities can stem the tide of losing their youth. And there may be some good strategies there, but I want to encourage you to not spend a lot of time on that. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So here's our losers in terms of age cohorts, and then we've got 35 to 39, 40 to 44, 45 to 49. We have more than expected in all of these age cohorts. Above the age of 65, you actually do have death rates influence those numbers, so I tend not to look above the age of 60, okay? Here's another way to look at it. Here's Grant County, and if you look at Grant County's population since 1900, it peaked in the 40s, 50s, and then declined. And this is from 90 to 2000. I'm using this as a demonstration because it really tells the depth of population change. So Grant County, if there were signs outside your county with your population on as opposed to city, their sign remained the same. And you ask Muriel Cruzmark, like, what's going on? Like, nobody ever really moves in or out. Like, really? 43% of Minnesotans move in a 5-year period, and you're telling me nobody ever moves in and out of your county. So we look at the data. Where the bar goes to the right is where we have more people than we expected, and where the bar goes to the left is where we lose people in those age categories. They lost 5.6% of their 15 to 19-year-olds, 43% of their 20 to 24-year-olds. Again, they were 10 to 14 before, and they graduated in between those two data points. And these graduated as well. So they lost 43% of that age cohort, 26, 27% of that, but they gained, their cohort of 30 to 34-year-olds went up by 50%. So this tells the story that even though you're losing your youth, in Grant County, you made up for it by bringing in people aged 30 to 50 that are bringing their kids. Does everybody get this? Because we're going to show more. This is the chart I want to use as we move forward a little bit. Okay. Mower County in Southeast, same story, losing the kids, bringing in people 30 to 50 that are bringing their kids, apparently bringing their kids. This is just data. I sat here and just stared at this for months, trying to figure out what's going on, talking to people in the county like, do you have this many people there? Like, I don't think so. Could not figure it out. Pine County, this is a recreational county. Again, they're high population growth in the 90s, 2000s. They're seeing the same gains, same losses. Hennepin County. Where do the kids go? Right? It is an inverse relationship between the rural demographic trend. And this is really interesting, and I love presenting this in Minneapolis and St. Paul because they think they're attracting people of all ages. And what do you see? They attract 3 age cohorts. 15, if they don't capture those people within that 15-year age range, they don't come, right? Ramsey County, St. Paul, same story, getting the youth, losing everybody. They only gain really 2 age cohorts there. But core urban areas, and you even see it, I just had a reporter from the Twin Cities talking about, well, there's this interest in seniors wanting to live back in the core city. I was like, who was telling you this? The developers. Okay, so now we're going to look at this statewide by age. So this is age 10 to 14 in the 90s and the 2000s. And the counties in white are the counties that experience loss. All the counties in gray are gradations of gains. So a gain of up to 10%, 10 to 25%, and 25 to 55% here. So you see the losses in the 90s that happened in Ramsey on the 10 to 14-year-olds, and there's a county there in Couchiching. I don't know what's going on in Couchiching up there. Started to see some variation in Swift and a couple other regional centers that at 10 years ago were experiencing gains, but now are experiencing losses. Now Swift County, just don't even look at Swift County data. They opened a prison between 90 and 2000 and closed one in 2010. It's incredibly difficult to interpret their data when you have prison populations plus their families there and trying to really get a grasp on what's going on. So Swift, I just leave that alone for now. Age 15 to 19. So again, some of these on the upper end have graduated and are moving to where? College counties, college and university counties. Winona, Blue Earth, Stearns. Same true here, 15, 19, 20 to 24. There's a small number of counties that actually are net importers of our youth. Losing your youth is the rule, not the exception. Oh, there it is. Losing youth is the rule, not the exception. So now I flip this. Which are the counties? So these are what percentage of your youth are leaving after high school? 40% on the higher, 20 to 40, and less than 20. And these are the only counties that gain. Again, they're the ones with colleges and university systems. So you can lose anywhere up to 60% of your youth after high school. And I really don't focus on them. 25 to 29, now we're starting to see migration to the core metro as well as the suburbs and Rochester. Age 30 to 34, these are the maps that really piqued my interest. 30 to 34, we see a large percentage change in this 30 to 34 cohort across almost all of rural Minnesota. This goes against the idea that people are always flocking away at all age from our rural communities. 35 to 39, there are very few counties, rural counties, that do not experience gains in the 35 to 39. And I'm going to talk about why this changed here in a few minutes. 40 to 44, I could hardly believe it, that the cohorts were getting this much bigger, that people were choosing to live in rural areas in these 30 to 50 year age cohorts. But really, the difference between the 90s and the 2000s is micropolitan effects. Lyon County, Nobles, Candy-Ojai, McLeod, Brown, Martin, well, that's really an urban cluster now. Douglas, Ottertail, these are micropolitan areas. And we'll see why this switched off in just a second, but this has an effect on this data now. 45 to 49-year-olds, now we're starting to see losses across the western corridor as well as southwestern Minnesota. So I want to go back here to these 40 to 44, 35 to 39. When I first published this, I just did Minnesota. And there were people calling the North Dakota state demographer like, what is this trend? Is this happening there? They're like, no, that's in Minnesota where they've got all the lakes. Where's all the lakes, right? In the prairie, people are choosing, this blew people's mind. Like, people are choosing to move to the prairie? Yeah. So I do a whole nother publication that detailed the national trends. 50 to 54, even more migration up to areas north of Minneapolis, St. Paul, mostly recreational areas. And I kind of stopped there again. Now we have death rates impacting the simplified cohort model, so I kind of cut it off there. So really there's this kind of breathing in and out of population migration across Minnesota. The youth leave your town, they'll go to the metro, they'll go to school, get experience, and then they move back out. And they're moving back out not just to suburban areas, but to rural areas too. I looked at the literature and could find so little written about this, even though the more I look back on the data, this has been happening since 1970. This isn't even that new. Right? But how many of you have heard of this before I presented this? Right. It doesn't fit the narrative. I don't always want to play it off on fitting the narrative, but I get frustrated because the narrative is so negative and that these really good ideas are not out there. So again, here's the pop change, one everybody likes to use in terms of wins and losses. And you look at the Great Plains states, we've got some severe population loss, severe in Nebraska especially, but southwestern Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, Iowa, South Dakota, all the way down to the panhandle of Texas. But when you look at the gains in 30 to 34-year-olds, just because you lose people overall doesn't mean you lose everyone. And the main reason why you lose population overall then is because you're losing more kids than you're bringing in. You're also losing your seniors as they go closer to medical facilities or to their family. It's not the meat of the age cohorts that you're losing. So Randy Cantrell Same map for the 2010. Again, just because you lose people doesn't mean you lose everyone. New York Times put out a graphic recently that showed what is the probability that if you are in the lowest quartile, or quintile, lowest fifth of socioeconomic status, what's the probability that your kids will end up in the top fifth? Blue is good. The Great Plains is where you want to be if you want to have the best chance for your kids to do better off than you are if you are low income. Jim Russell is a geographer, but he's a really migration geographer, really awesome. We had him at a conference at the Center for Small Towns here in June where I presented on some of this. But he has something that's called the age of return migration. And he talks about poverty and how traditional looks at poverty will look at a community and say their poverty rate is 18%. But what you don't see in that is that the people who move away from that community end up in the top half of incomes. Poverty is not a place-born identification. It's a people-born identification. And your people, what he'll say, and you should watch this video, it's on, I've got a link to it, but what he says is it's not the place that causes the poverty, it's the people. And you can still have high levels of poverty in a place, but the fact is you still end up with people moving out with earning potential. They just don't have the earning potential there. But that place still does a very good job of developing the skills and people needed to succeed as they move away. It made me re-examine how we look at poverty. So what is this trend? This growth is primarily in the 30 to 49 age cohort. This in-migration in can be just about equal to the out-migration out. I ran some quick numbers that, all right, what if these 30 to 49-year-olds had never been moving back the past, again, 40 years? Our rural populations would be about 10 to 18% lower than they are right now. If you are not seeing these newcomers, you're not seeing 30% of your community. We tend to get busy in our lives, right? I did some research in grad school and it's very academic, but it's non-overlapping interaction orders. And what that means is you don't overlap with everybody in your town. You shop at different times, you shop at different places, you eat at different times, you eat at different places. You like to recreate in certain places at different times. And I relate it to people working at different shifts. If you work first shift, you don't eat at the same time people at second shift eat. You don't sleep. You don't even see people that work different shifts. This is our rural community today. You don't know everybody in our small town. You might know 15% of the people in your small town, and you know even less than that well, because you don't see them. So it's very difficult to find these newcomers, but we did. So Randy Cantrell and Cheryl Burkhart led the effort in Nebraska, and we called it the Buffalo Commons Project. So what we found was that even in the panhandle of Nebraska, where they experienced overall population decline, there were all these newcomers, 30 to 49 coming back, populating the schools. I mean, literally could not believe it. When 25 years ago, called it the Buffalo Commons because 25 years ago there was a husband and wife team called Popper and Popper, the Poppers, wrote an article that said we should give the land back to the buffalo in the Great Plains because we're losing people, infrastructure costs are too high, how can we replace our water and sewer? We just can't keep this up. So let's give the land back to the buffalo. Well, for almost a year they had to have armed security because of the death threats against them. How a few simple words in like 6 pages of text can change how people view their own reality. So we called this the Buffalo Commons because it was people actually repopulating the Great Plains. So we found thousands of newcomers and we did focus groups. We sent out hundreds and thousands of surveys, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds and thousands in different places of surveys. And we asked them, why did you move here? Top 3 reasons were, number 1, safety, number 1, slower pace of life. Number 2, safety and security. This was especially true with people with kids. And number 3 is the low cost of housing. Nowhere in the top 10 was a job. This totally went against our assumptions. I mean, like, how do we, Because there's a whole bunch of literature out there on the economic development circles. It's a chicken or egg. Jobs or people? Which one do you work on? Do you get jobs and then get the people, or do you have to have people to get the jobs? It's not settled. But what we do know is that all of these thousands of people were coming back and job was not a top concern. In fact, it may have been aspects of their job that pushed them away, and it's aspects of this type of life that pulled them in. So there's push factors and pull factors. Who are these newcomers? We hypothesized, because we're scientists, we have hypotheses about what we think we're going to find. We hypothesized that 3/4 were going to be like previous residents. Like you graduated there and then you moved back. What we found was just 1/3 really had any previous contact with that community, with any sustained means. Might have been like, oh, I went to Bible camp up by Alexandria. How do you market to that? Marketing people almost struggle with this aspect of it, which is why I think it's important to get the community involved in this. 68% had a bachelor's. This is much higher than the resident population. They're making incomes at a higher level than the resident population. We thought almost 3/4 were going to have kids too, and just half of the newcomers had kids. They were really leaving their career. This was the economic development conundrum we noticed. This is the opportunity that we see, and we'll talk about this in a minute. They were underemployed, but really it was all about quality of life. Didn't care, did not care. It was about quality of life. So again, what is this trend? This movement of people is consistent and large. And it's not all about the out-migration of people, right? And consistent, I mean consistent that this has been happening since the 70s. And it's in recreational counties, it's in prairie counties, it's in the panhandle of Nebraska. Those moving into rural areas are in their prime earning years. This was, Randy and I cannot hit this point enough, that people are choosing to many times leave their career, leave their networks, leave their earning power and potential behind because of quality of life. So my point here is when we continue to use the narrative of brain drain to describe what's going on in our rural communities, we're doing a complete disservice to everybody who just chose to move into your town. You're going to call your community a brain drain community? What are you losing? Right? High school educated person with very few social contacts, very little experience, a lot of ideas about what could be. I taught statistics for a number of years at the University of Minnesota Morris, and one of my exercises right off the bat would be asking students, how much do you think you're going to make in your first job outside of college? Do you want to guess what their average was? $69,000. So then I go get general social survey data and we analyze the data. You know what the average is? 31,000. They just, I mean, I don't want to see people drop out of college, but like, wow, they were just, cannot believe this is the reality. So, kids' perception. So I've got colleagues who do work asking high school kids, you know, what's your intention to live in this community when you're an adult? Or no, they're adults, they're 18 years old. All right, so when they're 30. And they're like, I don't know. Yeah, I'll move back here. What's an 18-year-old know about what they're going to be doing in 15, 20 years? I don't mean to be flippant about it, but seriously. You're the worst predictor of your own life, right? So, I've got a colleague who does this work with kids asking these questions, and I'm so about the work. What I believe differentiates, if you're all kids in high school and 3 of you say I want to come back in one community, but this community over here, just 1 kid says they want to come back. For me, this is an indication more of the narrative in your community than it is about their true intention to come back. Because this community is probably talking positively about what they've got and what their future is and how the kids are involved, where that community does not. Does that make sense? So it's more about, for me, the indication of kids moving back is about the narrative, more about than are they actually going to come back. So I keep getting asked, like, what should we do about this? I have no idea. I don't want to say no idea, I have some ideas. But literally, people have tried almost nothing, and we're all out of ideas. I don't know what to do. It's almost comical. So, when I first started giving this presentation, people would ask me the names. Like, can you get me the names of all the newcomers? Like, I'm actually just looking at raw census data. I don't have real names behind this. So, more to my point is this movement of people in the 30 to 49 age cohort bringing their kids has happened without us doing much. Residential incentives are hit and miss. And hopefully we'll be doing a research project on that to actually show that. But we did a study in northwestern Minnesota that, whether you offered free land or free lots or free water hookups or whatever, did not make a difference in terms of the number of newcomers coming in. People are going to come into your community anyway. So, many of the people I work with in the industry are economic developers, and they say, why should I waste my time working on this newcomer recruitment, working on people recruitment? And it's because every newcomer household contributes almost $100,000 in income and spending every year. So I want to relate this to a small town, Hancock, population 700. If we set a goal to attract 7 people a year, which sounds really small, right? 7 people a year, maybe 2 families, maybe 3 or 2 couples, maybe a family. That would result in a 10% population increase every 10 years, which is like through the roof for a small town. Small numbers mean big things. Each one newcomer household you bring in has a significant impact. And this doesn't even include impacts on school districts, your funding formulas, property taxes. This is income earned and income spent, direct and indirect spending. There's many more impacts. So this is a very conservative estimate. The Pew Research Center. So I keep getting this, well, who wants to live in the country? Who wants to live in small towns? We know that roughly 26% of Americans live in a small town or a rural place, but Pew Research study asked people, where would you like to live? 51% of Americans would like to live in a rural area or a small town. It's idyllic what a rural area provides. Whether or not that's the reality is really beside the point, because people think they're going to find something in a rural place, and we should try to give it to them. So, I used to go ice fishing up at Lake of the Woods, and there was a sign along Highway 2, and it was awesome. Awesome. This is the picture. Play, live, work. I mean, you're on your boat, you got your laptop, you're doing your work. I don't know if anybody actually does it, but it's the visual. You go to the website, and it's full of acronyms. Full of SBDC, SBA, RLF, PRF. I mean, this is the best idea with the worst implementation I had ever seen in terms of actually, if I were a newcomer interested in moving to a small town up here, I wouldn't even know what to do with this website. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our own industry to work on recruitment strategies. So our main point here is that people move all the time. You graduate, you move, you probably move to the city or the college, you meet a spouse or a partner, you move, some may have kids and move, the kid graduates, they move, you probably move again, you retire, you move. You move all the time. People move all the time. And we want to be a point in rural Minnesota that we capture the movement of these people. So we're going to take a little break and have some discussion about this. And if you got other questions or other pieces you want to bring up, feel free to do it. But I'd like you to work at your tables. And just what are your reflections on this trend? Do you see it? Do you believe it's true? I mean, you could not believe it, and I'll point you to the research, and you can read it later. How does the regional center status of Willmar fit into this trend? And I'm going to give you an inkling of this. So, you remember the third top reason that people gave that they made the move? Low cost of housing. Housing prices in Willmar went up considerably since 1980, since the 90s. So I think the top 3 reason really for Willmar is taken away. Willmar more so is taking on an urban profile than a rural profile. So a few other snippets here. When we interviewed all these newcomers, and I think I may have this on a later slide, people did not look at just one town. They looked at 3 to 5 towns in a 45-mile radius. So Willmar is going to become the Hennepin and Ramsey County age demo, while all of the surrounding communities and counties are the rural profile. You're still a net attractor for shopping and for jobs. And this is why I was honored to be asked to come here today, because there are very few regional centers that are working on any type, well, I would say a lot of good visioning like this, but especially build upon this migration pattern. Because you've got a ton of experience now with newcomers, whether they be immigrants or not. You've got more experience than just about any other regional center in the state. More so than Worthington, more so than Marshall. You're well ahead of the game in lessons learned, which is why I think your reflections are going to be vital to understanding how we involve these newcomers in our small towns as we move forward. So with that caveat, how does the regional center status of Willmar fit into this trend? How can you work with surrounding counties, surrounding communities as a part of this effort? So I'll leave it at that. We're going to go until 11 o'clock, so 10 minutes of discussion, and we'll have some feedback time. I'll have more of a presentation, and then we'll wrap up. So Linda's got a microphone too. We're going to have one person from each table kind of report back on a summary, and I think maybe 1 minute worth from each table, report back on what you've discussed. All right, Linda.
Well, the first thing that I said is, according to those age demographics, it looks like I'm going to be single for a while. But no, we talked about Willmar being, the comment that you made about Willmar being more of a urban area, with being a regional area compared to a rural area, and had a conversation around that, and felt that we talked about how during the day the population in Willmar doubles. So the mindset of like a lot of, or the agreements that we had with a lot of the slides, I guess, is kind of the reflection that we had with the conversation or the presentation so far. So, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. This table, Jeff.
I was elected. I was glad I sat at this table. Our discussions went, I think, a whole flow, but we started out, I think, a lot about housing and why people are coming back here after that demographic of the maybe in their 30s into the 40s. Housing here compared to the Twin Cities or to Chicago, the larger metropolitan areas, is still much more reasonable. Even though we've had increases, it's still a good place to come and find a house for that, giving you much more disposable income. But now, what are you going to do with that disposable income, and what is there to do, so to speak? And that turned us then to the narrative. We know that we have a lot here, but we need to either market it, we need to talk about it, needs to become positive. So when new employees come to work at our businesses, a lot of their questions are, what is there for me to do? And we need to have those answers. And one of our groups said, well, oh, sure. We need to have that discussion with them, or ask them first, what are you doing now as compared to what you would do here in Willmar? So that was kind of part of it, and then it went really to, telling a positive story and letting people know the good things that are here. And we did talk about that there's some couple of standard stories that are always kind of about Willmar and the people that aren't from here going and talking about them, and those have to kind of be answered. So that was kind of that.
Great, thank you, Tom. Charlie. Tom. All right, here we have Tom. If you could please stand, please. And the camera is behind you.
Oh, great, even better. We discussed a lot how a lot of this information really validated everything that we're doing right now with the 2040 vision, and a lot of the concepts about housing and about things to do are really validated, and that we're on the right track. One of the areas that we discussed was that when all of these young people go off to college into the Twin Cities, they get used to a lot of the amenities in the Twin Cities. And so when they're looking for a community to move back to, if those amenities that they're used to are not there, they may look for a different community. So that was two of the areas that we were looking at.
Great. Thank you. How about this group? Thank you very much.
Our group actually discussed two basically opposing views of the data that was presented. There were certain people in our group that could track very well based, their experiences. This data validated what they have seen in their work lives and days. And then there was one hard-headed person that kind of has a different kind of wondered and wanted to question the speaker about the sample of people you interviewed, because this one hard-headed person didn't see a lot of people moving in with skills, with buying power, into this community, with skills and buying power, and so it was just a good, lively debate.
Thank you. This table? Is that you? Thank you.
Sure. So basically, this was my life story about how I was one of the people that left. I'm from a small town in northern Minnesota, and I went to college in the Twin Cities and lived there till I was 30, and then I moved out here for a slower life and live on a farm. And it was interesting because it was kind of a lot of our story is that when I moved out here, we had a lot of negative feedback from maybe people in our own age. And, but yet when we got here, we were very welcomed and feel like this is more home. And it was a similar story for all of us. And it was so just interesting to hear really what's happening as a trend and be encouraged as a newcomer to the area who drives into Willmar to work. Really that this is a trend and that it's a positive trend when you hear a lot of the negative in your work.
Thank you very much. And I have to say that this was my personal story too, about why we moved here in our 30s. Arlen.
I wasn't listening, so I was delegated, I guess. We had some words that resonated. The camera. Oh gosh. Never give a politician a microphone and a camera. That's the worst possible combination. Okay. Yeah. All right. The 5 words that resonated with us, and we spent a lot of time discussing, was perception, marketing, recognizing the significance that we have in opportunity, and that we are stronger as part of the whole, and not considering ourselves only the whole. And you can interpret whole with a W or starting with an H, either way. It depends upon what perception you have with that type of opportunity. I think overall that we certainly had intent discussion. We had no difference, but I think we agree, and I know Carissa very well, this is her story. Frankly, this is my story from years ago, but it's the same type of story. Doug mentioned his family, son, daughter, their 2 daughters, their stories as well. So I think we have to realize that these have been going on, but we have allowed either negativity or perception to govern. And it is certainly from this particular table is saying we have to market based on our differences, based on our similarities, and most of all, based on the presentation, so we are presenting ourselves in the positive and promoting an accuracy and reality.
Thank you, Arlen. This table. Pat?
Yes, I got nothing. We had a lot of very similar discussions to the rest of the tables, but again, the status of Willmar as a regional center is all the small communities want to maintain their own identity, so it's hard to wrap that into Spicer's different than Willmar, that's different than Benson, that's different than Belgrade, and most of the table was from out of Willmar. Worked in Willmar or went through, but not living there. So we talked about it needs to be a partnership to allow areas to maintain their identity, but still what's good for Willmar is good for the region and good for everybody, and that's just a fact of the matter, and we can't downplay that at all. Housing, spent a lot of time talking about housing and just the need to have, there needs to be a variety of types of housing available, but people need to be able to come here and start working here and have some starter housing or affordable housing available to them. And we talked about the importance of Willmar having a balanced portfolio. You don't invest and put all your money into one type of stock or one type of industry, but you balance your portfolio, and we're lucky to have a broad base of that. And technology is important to Willmar. Ag is important to Willmar, manufacturing is important to Willmar, and just maintaining the importance of that diversity that's in Willmar. So we talked about those things.
Thank you. This table. Steve? I had to leave before we agreed. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Steve Alman. I just want to say thank you for your presentation and your information. It was really earth-shattering and woke me up to a lot of my perception that you people allude to. Thanks for all the people that are attending here. I think a lot of times people don't take the time to get together and talk to one another to find out who they are, what their personality is, and what their thoughts are. A lot of it's based on perception of individuals and by small talk and coffee talk. And so we talked about housing. And I got some information from the online, by the way, at the state of Minnesota that was pretty shocking. If I could have that, Tim. I just want to point out a few facts that came up. What's going on in our community? The city of Willmar, Vision 2040, what's happening? We have state average versus what we have in our community, and this is based on 2010 facts. The state average is 91.9% for high school graduation. We have 83.2. Bachelor's degree, and this is one that really surprised me. Bachelor's degree, we have 19.8%, and yet we have 32.2% as a state average. Home ownership rate, and here's the big one, 58.5% is the city of Willmar as far as home ownership. State average is 73%. We also talked about the amount of multi-housing homes. We have a large percentage, much higher percentage of multi-housing family units in the community than we do the state average, 32.5% versus 21.6%. The average median per capita money income is $30,656, and ours is $21,946. So the trend always comes down to money. And my personal thoughts I was sharing with the people here has been a concern of mine for quite a while. As a building contractor and home builder, I've seen the decline of home ownerships or homes that were built in the city of Willmar. We had 14 houses built in the year 2010 or later. This is a little outdated. 14. From 1990 to 1999, we had 1,195. In 1980 and 1989, we had 1,174. 1970 and 1979, we had 1,758. 1960 to 69, we had 801. That's where our growth was. What we've seen is a trend for people moving out into the county, and I've asked Charlene to get some information together that the City Council needs to work on. That should really give us a little bit of a better solution of how we're going to start changing the issue of having revenue to build this great vision and all these great ideas. But we first need to have the capital. And if we have less money coming into our communities, we're not building a community. We're building a rural setting, which adds to the overall expenses to our school system and everything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, this table? Is that you done?
Yes.
All right, thank you. We have one more table.
A lot of things we covered here. The rest of the group has covered already, but we found that it was refreshing to hear the stats in a different manner than what we typically hear. Stats as being presented today present a very positive outlook on where we are in the rural settings and where we're going. And we also talked about the 2040 vision, where that's going and how the statistics that are being presented today can help and support where we want to go, and that we need to continue building on what we're doing, because we can keep the people here, maybe not just in Willmar, but when we look regionally, we can retain and grow our area and our community and our businesses. So very similar to the rest of the table's discussion. So thank you.
Last table?
Thanks for saving us till last. we talked about many of the same things, but we had a really interesting table to have this discussion with, because we had two of our, Steve and Wayne here, having been in the community for 30 plus years, and Sean having just recently moved to the community, and myself coming to the community 6 years ago now. And both Sean and I have a similar experience, in that is we chose to bring our families to Willmar for what Willmar offered. The job obviously was part of that, but both of us had other options and other alternatives, and we chose to come to Willmar. So it is interesting, the stories that we're hearing around the room here, and how it's very similar to ours as well.
Great, thank you. And if I could just take this time before I turn it over to Ben to make a plug for Goal 1, attracting and retaining newcomers to the Willmar Lakes area. We have 4 subgroups, if you're familiar with it. We have housing is one. The other one is Connect and Concierge, where we're trying to do an online presence, which kind of ties into your marketing of our community and making sure people have access to what they're looking for when they're looking for it. And it's also connection, a personal connection. And when we leave here today, there's going to be a sign-up sheet at the back. And I encourage anyone who wants to be that newcomer to welcome someone who is new to our community, whether it happened for you or not, to sign up and say, I would like to make that personal connection. Then we also have increasing our Wi-Fi and broadband access. When we moved here in 2004, I did not dream that Wi-Fi would be an issue for me. I was home office and I relied on access to the internet. And thankfully, my family chose the right neighborhood and the right community to be able to support that kind of working environment that I've been doing since 2000. And then our last group, someone help me. We have 3. Who's in here? It's improving the experience of first-generation immigrants, and also looking at forming a diversity coalition and how our community needs this. So again, thank you on behalf of Vision 2040. Going to turn it over to Ben. Appreciate you.
Thanks. Okay, thanks everyone. I've got some really good notes here. I like to hear all these reflections. There's a lot of times I'm just called in to speak at like for 40 minutes or whatever, and never have actual time to hear back. So I would encourage you to actually email me too if you've got other thoughts or reflections. I'm going to touch on some of the things that points that were brought up. The amenities piece. Amenities definitions vary person by person. So to compare, my point is that rural areas, especially Willmar, we're in the middle of everywhere. We're not in the middle of nowhere. If you want to get to the Twin Cities, it's right over there. If you want to get to the lakes, they're here. If you want to get to different communities and different businesses, they're there too. So I kind of turn that on its head a little bit in terms of, again, if we have people moving to southwestern Minnesota where many would deem it to be amenity poor, but we're still seeing plenty of newcomers moving out there. So one person's definition of amenity is your definition of amenity. And as you talk to other people, I think it varies. In terms of citing statistics on school performance, I think it's not the fact that the rates are lower, it's the fact that you can improve those numbers. I would encourage you to look back on statistics, however slight they are, of when the immigrants first came to the country. And how fast is fast enough for improvement? I had discussions before that even as little as 50 years ago, we had entire newspapers written in German and in different languages. So as you guys have experience here in Willmar with the immigrant populations, don't be in a hurry. Do it right. It will happen and it will be good. So, and again, you guys are at the forefront of this, so don't feel like you're behind the 8 ball on this. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about, so summarizing this trend, there's this narrative that really there is a national, societal preference to live in small towns and rural places. It's just we don't always have places for these people to go. Not everybody is leaving our small towns, so again, I hope I gave you the ammo behind that. We have this new urbanity popping up across rural areas as the Mankato becomes urbanized, the Willmar, the Worthington, Mankato. I mentioned Mankato. And this trend really continued in the 2000s, but it slowed. And if you looked at the map, not all of the counties that benefited in the 90s or in the 70s, which I didn't have those maps, benefited in the 2000s. So we had a couple of different factors that we think play into it. First is the high price of fuel in the latter half of the decade, plus the housing crisis, settled people in. Migration rates dropped by 3 to 4%. People are settled in their homes. But also, the large number of people that moved into our small towns in the 90s filled up a lot of vacant homes. Our small towns did a lot of work in taking care of dilapidated homes. We just don't have the housing stock choice that we had 20 years ago even. So for me, this is the number one topic for our small towns. So as it bridges over to another one of the goals that you've got, marketing can't be done. I mean, a lot of good, advertising jobs in your community is going to do if you don't have any place for people to live. We see this up and down the state in extension. We talk about this every week. Our educators hear about the housing shortage. If you're going to have a next symposium having a discussion about our small towns, it should be about housing. But I've got some ideas on that too. So I've got some other kind of data points here that I thought were very interesting for Candy Ojai. And one is a lot of employment numbers you see put out by the state are wage and salary employees. But there's a whole nother crop of people that do work in your county that are not wage and salary. And they're proprietors, they're self-employed, they're 1099ers. 1099ers are people that do contract work for a company for a very specific time frame, for a very specific project, and then they're done, and they move on. They're freelancers. In Candy Ojai, there are, let me find this here. The axis on the right is the is the red at the top. So there's just under 7,000 proprietors and self-employed. The chart on the left, there's about 23,000 wage and salary. So about 20% of all the people working in your county are not working for someone. They're working for themselves. This is usually under the radar. This is not just entrepreneurial. This is newcomers working for companies that may be in a different county, maybe in a different state, maybe in a different country. We heard stories all in all. Again, there's a question about the sample size that we used in asking these newcomers. We had over 4,000 interviews and 32 focus groups. And when I give the statistic about 92,000, that's the average. Of course you're going to have low income in there. Of course you're going to have higher income in there. But I would actually encourage you, if you question the data, to start interviewing the newcomers yourself. My work is done, in a sense. So if you want to know them, I'll give you the surveys we use, the questions we asked. And what was more surprising, if you question the statistics, is how consistent these numbers are between Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa. If we just saw this happen in one little snippet part of the state, we would say that that's an anomaly, but it's not. And that's what we do research for. So, getting back to this data point is this kind of self-employed economy. We did all these interviews. My point here is, just because a company does not have a brick and mortar presence in your community doesn't mean that company doesn't have a presence if they're employing someone. If you have one person, book editor out of Benson, that works for a company in the Twin Cities, that company has a presence in your community. But if you don't go out and find these people, they're not going to come to you to be counted. So my point with this is that about 1 in 5 of your workers may not exactly be on your radar. This is probably my favorite chart. Not of all charts, but of kind of economic numbers. So this looks at, the one I'm really interested in here is transfer payments. This line right here, and it's up to about 20%. This is all of the dollars coming into your county. People work for a living, they make money, those are earnings. They gain retirement benefits, these are transfer payments. Unemployment is also included in transfer payments. These are payments made from the feds down to you. So old age Social Security is in there, retirement benefits are in there, unemployment is in there, but it's a small percentage. A bulk of this, transfer payments, is made up of retirement. And right now, 1 in 5 dollars of your county does not come from a job. It comes from retirement benefits. So, if you want to keep these dollars, make sure there's housing for seniors. And I'm not talking about old age homes, because you've got the whole continuum of care, right? Some people just want to go visit their kids for a month and not have to worry about their lawn being overgrown. There is going to be a large circulation of people, and we are just at the beginning right now with the baby boomers. We are just at the beginning of the baby boomers freeing up housing stock for everybody else to move into. What you don't want is for people to stay in their homes to the point that the home is dilapidated, right? Does this make sense? Look at your data, count the number of homes that are owned by people over the age of 50. These are the number of homes that are going to be made available to people in your community, and it's a large number of homes that are going to be made available. So much to the point, my back-of-the-envelope calculations with Randy Cantrell in Nebraska shows that in Minnesota in the next 10 to 15 years, 3 to 7% of all the housing won't even have a buyer. The number of people leaving their homes as baby boomers exceeds the demand. So supply is number of people leaving their homes, demand is number of people looking for homes, and we do know some other demographic traits. The millennial generation is buying homes at like 10, we're off 10 to 15 points of home ownership rates. So it's not a surprise to me that you have a high rental percentage. That's based on income, but it's also due to other societal factors. I mean, just last year is the first time that, so we've had all these, apparently the home purchasing numbers have recovered, but it's recovered not because of individuals buying homes, it's recovered because of institutional buyers. Do the research on who's buying your homes. It's not people with their families. So there's a lot of complexity in this housing area that I'm not even getting into, but hopefully I'll give you enough to pique your interest and get your housing people involved in thinking about migrating homes, because homes change hands. And not to say that we want to encourage it, but we want to encourage people to move. Does that make sense? Supply and demand of housing stock, the baby boomer implications. Again, if you want to retain that 20%, you can easily lose it. You won't, I'll just tell you. Willmar is positioned in a way that that number is only going to go up. The percentage of all the income in your county is probably going to be around 25 to 35% by the time the baby boomer retirements hit their peak. I mean, you spend what, 75 to 80% of all of your lifetime medical expenditures in your last 10 years. I think it's actually smaller. I think it's more like 5 years. So usually my presentation is to smaller counties that obviously don't have the advantage of having healthcare facilities. And for them, it's even more important on that continuum of care to get people while they're still functioning and, you know, just want a different home. It's just a different preference. You don't want the 2-bedroom house. You want a condo that might have it mowed or whatever it's going to be. Find out what those preferences are. So, there's another notion out there under this whole umbrella of rewriting the rural narrative that somehow rural areas, that somehow newcomers don't want to be involved in our existing social infrastructure. And I'll tell you a story. When I moved back to Hancock, so I went to Missouri for 5 years, moved to Hancock, and I had lived in Morris before and was in the Red Cross and did things there. This is one of my favorite stories. So I moved back to Hancock, got the phone hooked up and everything. Within a week, there was a message on my machine when I came home one day that said, "Ben, you were elected vice chair of the Red Cross." And I hadn't even been to a meeting in 5, 6 years, which was fine. I was in the Red Cross before. I loved the Red Cross. So I took it on. My friends would have been aghast if they would ever get a message like that. They're all urbanites, you know, living in the city. They want to be involved, but in different ways. Then a week after that, somebody came up to me and said, "Do you want to join the Lions?" And gives me the blank stare. Like, I have no idea what that means. I don't want to show up at a meeting and there's 3 people there and all of a sudden I'm shouldering 25% of the load, carrying on activities for an organization I had 0 part of. So I did for a while, but I ultimately just left it. I didn't feel connected in any way. My story is not unique. What's unique is I actually said yes to the Red Cross. So we see headlines today that talk about people, we can't find people to run for council or county commissioner or chamber. We find difficulty getting people, you know, we can't find young people for our groups. Here is the sociological answer for that. The young people do not want to be involved in your groups. The major difference is, historically, community-based organizations, nonprofits, okay, social associations, like de Tocqueville, he ran around in 1831, ran around the eastern seaboard of the United States and was like, man, these Americans love getting together to solve problems. Like, they got together and built a church. They got together and built a school. And then they dissolve themselves and go back to the community and go about their daily life until a struggle or something comes up that they need to work on. And I love that idea. But what's the part of de Tocqueville's model that doesn't exist today? Disillusion. When is the last time you voluntarily dissolved a community group? Right? Okay, this is a very hard question to talk about. But what I do know is the research shows that historically our groups were place-based, broadly focused, had word of mouth is how things got done. It's very idyllic, this idea of, everybody getting together in town to like complete something, whatever it is. The Hancock Community Betterment Club did everything from helping the school build their playground to putting up the community center to doing whatever. Place-based, broadly focused, right? Today, our community groups cover wide geographic areas and very narrow interests. The West Central Minnesota Bicycle Association. Very specific task. And this shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, we're in an individualistic society. This is just reflecting our individual interests. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, so does this make sense, the major shift? So we got all our existing groups, again, our like county lines and city lines are drawn at a time of horse and buggy, and now all of a sudden we're trying to get people to be involved in these place-based groups where the place matters so little in people's lives that they have trouble connecting to the social infrastructure is what's called. Some data. Social life really is not dying then. Nonprofit growth in Minnesota between 2000 and 2010, we had a 7.8% population growth in the state, but over the same time period, there's a 19.4% increase in the number of nonprofits. This was, again, a stat that just blew my mind. Like, really? There are 3 times the number of nonprofits, the growth of nonprofits, as population growth. Even in the most rural counties in Minnesota where we experience almost a 5% decline in population, there's still a 15% increase in nonprofits. This tells me people do want to be involved. So quit telling these newcomers they need to get involved in my group and start seeing where they're being involved at. Here's Candy, Ohio. Number of nonprofits from 1995 went from 242 up to 315 today. You're not afraid to start groups. This is actually really good news in terms of your social infrastructure. You're adaptable. You're creating groups that reflect your social interests. These don't exist in some netherland like a nonprofit all of a sudden presents itself to your community. The issue is we have very few connections between our nonprofits. I gave this presentation, there's actually a whole hour-and-a-half presentation just on these 3 slides that talks about a lot of different motivations and things. One of the counties I gave this presentation in, which will remain nameless, took this data and said, we're going to have a summit of nonprofits. And I thought, that's awesome. Because when you're increasing the number of nonprofits, you're competing over a limited supply of people, time, money. Your average dollar per nonprofit that's given goes down because now you've got more people, more organizations competing for people's money. Some groups have 3 to 4 people. What are they doing? Complaining about nobody coming to their meeting. So this community had a nonprofit summit. And what it turned into was all of the nonprofits circled around the outside of the room looking to sign up volunteers. My message usually out of this is you need strategic direction from the leadership of all of your nonprofits to recognize this trend, number 1, that you've got an increasing, almost unsustainable number of nonprofits. Number 2, you don't have any way to actually imbue leadership skills to these new groups. So you've got groups that are struggling with 4 to 5 people for years that have a vast amount of leadership experience that are completely disconnected from the new groups. Leadership development is necessary. So there are very few studies that talk about what makes for a good I talk about this with my faculty member in Missouri all the time, that, there's no real studies out there about what's the price you pay for bad leadership. You don't study all these nonprofits that are doing horrible. And I was like, well, maybe you just measure the number of lawsuits, that where your leadership is actually struggling to make good decisions, and they actually make decisions poorly in a way that ends up in a lawsuit. But we really don't have a good answer. There's no good literature on it. So all I can say is I would encourage you to make sure there are pathways for leadership for all of your new groups. But first of all, you have to find the new groups. The National Center for Charitable Statistics has an awesome website where I get all my data from. Lists all your nonprofits, the year they were formed, their assets, their 990s are on there. The proportion of 990 of nonprofits that file 990s as opposed to 990Ns, meaning you have to have over 20 or 25,000 in income. All of these matter. Research shows that counties with more nonprofits per capita had lower unemployment, lost fewer jobs during the recession. Both patterns remain even when holding everything constant. Nonprofits are an indicator. We're super lucky to be in Minnesota. I go to Brazil and I get called in to talk to some community group, and they're like, we got to find a way to build a playground. I was like, well, let's get a bunch of people together and talk to businesses. No, the government needs to build a playground. There is no sense of civil society there whatsoever. If they don't have something, it's because the government didn't give it to them. I was like, I'm done. I don't know how to work in that atmosphere. That's not necessarily indicative of everything, but it's a different mindset. Also in Minnesota, we're very lucky. There's a reason why we are the home to some of the earliest cooperatives in this country, because we actually do not mind working together to get things done. And when it's 20 below in the winter and you're trying to homestead your place, you better be working together. So I want to delineate between two very important topics here. This should shape how you think of all of your strategies moving forward. There is a significant difference between recruitment and retention. Recruitment is regional and very individualistic. Like, we want you to come to this community because of things that you are looking for. So there are things called people attraction strategies. And we had a whole conference. Again, I would encourage you to look up, and I'll share this link so you'll get the PDF of the PowerPoint, and I'll share some other links with you too. But we had a whole conference around this idea. And kind of the idea that we're in the middle of everywhere and small numbers mean big things. I've already touched on those pieces. Retention involves places, and retention involves social integration. This is where your place matters. If people do not feel connected socially to their community, they're going to be more than likely to leave. People intermix these two terms all the time, but they're very different ideas. You have different strategies economically and socially for both. So on the map strategies, this was done in a research report I did a number of years ago, but really right now provide avenues for potential. So how does your community or your region get on the map? And at the time that we did this, Google Map does a pretty horrible job of approximating rural anything. So even in Morris, when we were doing this mapping in Morris, the hotel in Morris was listed 3 miles west of town. And it's actually right on Highway 28, right in the middle of Highway 28 in the city, So when you make these changes, you go to Google and you find out things are wrong. You correct, there's a thing called report a change or whatever, and you drag it to where it should be. And then Google will call the business owner and say, so-and-so just changed the location. Do you agree to that? So what we would do is we would be ready to move it, and I would call the business owner, and I was actually there that day, and I said, hey, we're going to move your Google Map location over from, west of town to Morris. And she was like, well, it was 3 miles west. And a light bulb went off, and she said, that's why people kept saying, I'm surprised you're here. And what she thought was like, we're in a good sized town, we can have a hotel here, you're surprised we have a hotel. What they meant was they Googled the hotel, and it was over there, and the people were like, oh, I can't believe it's right here. She never put it together until we actually did that. So make sure your Google Maps is a very simple thing. Make sure all your assets are on there. Housing is economic development. I'm not going to hammer this point home anymore. Provide a resource that allows potential newcomers to establish a personal connection to the region. Right now, these newcomers have generally been moving in without us doing anything. They're doing all the work. So if there is any opportunity for newcomers to establish a personal counselor, or whatever you want to call it, to your region, it can be vital to bringing somebody actually to your region as opposed to someone else's. Engage with real estate agents to track motivations and interests. I can't tell you how important this was to identify who are these people thinking about moving in, what's their family structure, what kind of jobs are they looking for. They're on the front lines of people looking to move into your area. You may have to have confidential conversations with them, but have those conversations with them. Employment strategies. This is one that's not well researched, and there are very few groups that do work. So, you know, we have all this good news about rural, but part of the reason why I think the narrative hasn't necessarily changed for rural areas is because good things don't get grants all the time. You get grants to help solve problems. We have an out-migration problem. Let's get a grant for that. These negative frames continue to dominate the discussion. So, getting back to the narrative piece here, before I get on this, getting back to the narrative. So if we have an entire narrative that's built around a deficit approach of rural areas, when you see good things happen, you think they're the exception. If you have a positive backdrop to what's happening, when you see good things, it's actually the everyday. So, a major news outlet did a web-based story book thing. I don't know what you call them. It's on the web and you watch it. And it was all about the struggling rural. You start it up and the music is all very sorrowful. But the story's within it about a person who started a business and this flourishing nonprofit. But it's couched in all of this negativity that you think the good things that are happening are the exception. Like, I can't believe this person started a business in Barrett. People are starting businesses all the time in rural areas. These things are not the exception, but this is what happens when you have an entire narrative that's negative. The good things are the exception. Does that make sense? So there's all these good things that happen that shouldn't be viewed as the exception. They're just the everyday. And we can celebrate them still without the negativity. So, employment strategies. So our research did show there are plenty of people that have existing connections to metro businesses, even though they took a different job when they got here. If we're serious about building a new economy, and Robert Bell wrote a book called Brain Gain just 6 months ago, and we have to build a new economy on top of the old, starting from step one. This is not amending, this is not appending, this is not connecting to any existing economy. This is a new economy that needs to be built. And I would say start with these newcomers, because they've got all of these skills. Again, they're underemployed, not necessarily doing what they're trained in. Find out what those skills are, find out what those networks are, what that experience is. And this takes time. If you don't want to spend the time actually talking to newcomers, then don't. But if you do, you can help build the new economy. This is the brain gain economy. You've got tons of comparative advantage here because you've got institutes of higher education. You've got immigrant populations, which only strengthens the social capital for your community that many other towns across the state do not have. Comparative advantage. Identify and build upon these auxiliary skills. And I call them auxiliary skills because they're no longer their primary skills. They used to be a financial advisor, but now they're doing something else. These people still have very strong connections, and there was a consistent thread of, like, these newcomers were missing their old career. So if there's a way to help continue that career, that's the work to do. Newcomer events. I got some random things here. Some things that work really well is actually just have newcomer suppers. Invite your newcomers in, and especially in places like Willmar, it's a little difficult because you don't just go within the city limits. You might actually go through the businesses that have, 40 to 90% of your employees are coming in from outside of town. You may have to advertise these newcomer events through your businesses. but have newcomer-only events. And it's very simple. Spend $250 on a meal for your newcomers. And it's not a big push to say, I need you on our nonprofit. It's not that. It's a very simple asset-based community development approach. Get them to stand up, introduce themselves, talk about their family, what brought them here, and they develop their own connections. We've done this a number of times now. I've never seen anything more powerful in terms of newcomers connecting with one another. The key finding we have is the newcomers consistently say, I had no idea there were this many newcomers in town. And this is in towns of 200 people. So if you think there are no newcomers, go and try to find them. When we first started doing our research, so we started doing it in a 5-county area first, and we thought, all right, we're going to get our shared Google Doc together, and we're all going to go off to our towns and write down names and put in the Google Doc, and we're going to invite all these newcomers to a focus group and stuff. And we thought we'd be happy getting 75 or 80 people. We had 890 names on that list in 3 weeks. It was, just to give you an idea of what you find when you look for it. So newcomer events, again, it's all about the newcomers. Affordable housing. Again, this is where you've got a regional advantage, a small town surrounding Willmar. It's not about building new housing necessarily all the time. You've got a market for that, but I think what we have consistently struggled with is identifying how to build affordable new housing. I did some research a number of months ago that I looked at all of these reports about affordable housing, and in half of the reports, there wasn't even a dollar sign. I did a find in the PDF, Control F, and look for a dollar sign. How can you talk about affordable housing without actually talking about money? So that kind of frustrated me, like, is $1,800 a month affordable then? There was actually no definition, so you actually have to come up with some numbers as to what's affordable. Future opportunities here, the immigration and regional centers. Again, this is general Minnesota trend, but you guys have that massive comparative advantage to the rest of the state. Baby boomer retention, again, talked about this. There's an increase in housing supply for potential newcomers, but you need to recognize what the demand preference or the preferences are for this for the housing demand of the seniors as they move. Get on that now. This is the area to work on because the housing stock that the seniors were in are going to be your supply. Transfer payments, we talked about that. Millennials, this one's a little more difficult. There was another story, Star Tribune person that talked to me about the residential preference of newcomers, of the millennials, and said the millennials wanted big houses on small lots. And I could not find a lick of evidence to support that. Literally, my entire conversation was off the record because I had nothing to contribute. I was like, that has never crossed my radar. So again, think about motivations behind statements. That's pretty much it. There are some other examples of people doing recruitment things. It's very haphazard. Some things work, some don't. Some tread water for a while. See what works for you. Again, you've got the advantage here. Normally, this presentation I do is in very small counties or small communities. So this was a really good opportunity for me to actually present this in a regional center because this is the hub of the region. You can get into all the parochialism about my town, I want my identity. You do have your identity when it comes to retention. But when it comes to recruitment, you're in the middle of everywhere. I've got over 600 pieces of paper where I used to hand out, like rooms like this, hand out a state map and have people put an X where they live, a star where they work, a radius around where they shop, and another radius around where they play. No town is a one-stop shop. No town has been a one-stop shop for 25 years. Rural people do not mind driving, obviously. We're in a rural place. Think about your regional assets. I don't know how to hit on that anymore. So I will just end it there. So thank you for your time.